Good. So welcome everyone to the latest installment in our virtual 2021 conference. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Susanne Lettow to this talk, this event. Professor Lettow is in the philosophy department at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She works widely on social and political philosophy, including feminism and gender studies, as well as on German Idealism and Naturphilosophy, obviously including Hegel. Her two books have the titles in translation of The Power of Concern, Sorge, The Philosophical Articulation of Gender Relations in Heidegger's Being and Time, 2001, and Biophilosophies, Science, Technology and Gender in Contemporary Philosophy Discourse, 2011. And her talk today brings together many of those themes, I'm guessing, at least by the title, and focusing on Hegel. The title is Kinship, Race and Reproduction, Hegel's Articulation of Genealogy. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Lettow to her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for the invitation to share my thoughts with you in this lecture series. And thank you so much for the nice introduction. Indeed, the title of my talk today is Kinship, Race and Reproduction, Hegel's Articulation of Genealogy. Well, in the decades around 1800, genealogical imaginaries underwent far-reaching change. So the rules of marriage and family formation, modes of the transmission of wealth, privilege, and power from one generation to the next wavered, as did the cultural and political understandings of community, nation, and humanity. And notions such as sex, race, reproduction, population emerged in that period and contributed to a reconceptualization of belonging to social and natural orders. The transformation of kinship relations that took place during the period has been characterized by historians David Sabian and Simon Teuscher as, I quote, a move from vertical to horizontal relationships, from a system distributing rights through patrilineal succession down the generations to a much more fluid set of networks constructed through marrying endogamously, mobilizing affinal kin, and building obligation within sibling archipelagos. Stephanie Engelstein, for example, has argued that the long 19th century developed a set of theories and practices that placed the sibling at the foundation of epistemological systems on which subjectivity, civic organization, economic networks, and scientific methodologies were grounded. So certainly the social and the epistemic implications of the transformations of kinship relations were complex, and they preoccupied contemporaries in myriad ways. So not least they inspired reflections that shaped philosophies, literature, and the sciences of the period. And Hegel dealt with these social and epistemological transformations in various respects and in different parts of his philosophy. In the eyes of Sabian and Teuscher, Hegel was a central witness to the reframing of the language of kinship. However, I think that he was more than a mere witness to the transformation of kinship relations, but an active protagonist, and contributed to this transformation by reshaping, reconstructing genealogical thinking. So by engaging with issues of kinship and family, with disputes over racial diversity, And with the scientific debates about life, reproduction, and sexual difference, Hegel, I think, contributed to a philosophical articulation of genealogical relation and made these social and cultural transformations intelligible in a highly peculiar way. Now, in the first part of my talk, which also will be the longest part of the talk, I will discuss Hegel's articulations of kinship and the family in the phenomenology of spirit and in the philosophy of right. And then in the second part, I will turn to Hegel's discussion or Hegel's account of racial diversity. And in the third part, finally, to Hegel's understanding of reproduction in the philosophy of nature. And I then briefly conclude by arguing that I think that exploring Hegel's or the semantic interrelations among Hegel's reflection on kinship, race, and reproduction throughout his writings is not only relevant for critical Hegel scholarship today, but also gives impulses to gender studies that needs to develop accounts that go beyond the critique of binary gender constructions and also beyond narrow understandings of intersectionality. So I start with the first part. In her seminal essay on Antigone's claim, Judith Butler argues that Antigone disturbs rather than represents the laws of blood relationships, as Hegel would have it. Antigone's father is her brother, Butler explains, since they both share a mother in Jocasta, and her brothers are her nephews, sons of her brother father, Oedipus. This means that Antigone is, according to Butler, caught in a web of relations that produce no coherent position in kinship. Antigone, in Butler's view, does not function as a figure who articulates a pre-political opposition to politics, but in contrast, she reveals the social and political character of kinship norms, and thus offers an allegory for the crisis of kinship or for the fragility and historicity of kinship norms. Indeed, as I said in the beginning, kinship norms were far from stable in Hegel's own time, so that it seems to me that this aspect of his discussion of Antigone, unacknowledged by himself, is of central importance, not only as Butler argues for today's struggles over kinship norms, but also for an understanding of Hegel's philosophical rearticulation of synchronic and diachronic dimensions of kinship. Far from being coherent, Hegel's theoretical accounts of kinship and the family are characterized through various ambivalences. Theoretical tensions exist not only between the phenomenology of spirit and the philosophy of right, but also within the accounts given in these texts. As Kimberly Hutchings has argued with regard to the philosophy of right, Hegel is in fact drawing our attention to the instability of the boundaries between family, civil society, and the state, and also of the temporal boundary between the then of kinship and the now of the family. Thus, he neither presents trans-historical truths, nor does he give an historically adequate account of the transformations of the period, but instead articulates these transformations in his own philosophical vocabulary. In the widely read sections on the ethical world in the Phenomenology, Hegel distinguishes between a female divine law that represents imperatives of consanguine kinship and a human law, or the imperatives of the political community. Both laws, according to Hegel, belong to what he calls the ethical order, but in his view, the ethical life of the divine law of the family is peculiar, namely negative ethical life. This is the case because the ethical order is in principle always geared towards universality and transcends the particularism of the sphere of kinship and family relations. Insofar as they are members of the family, individuals are kin, not citizens. But there is, according to Hegel, one action that belongs to the sphere of kinship relations that transcends the particularism of that sphere, so that he considers it to be a positive ethical action. And this action is a burial through which the blood relationship, I quote, the blood relationship supplements the abstract natural movement by adding to it the movement of consciousness. The family, as Hegel puts it, is a natural ethical community and weds the blood relation to the bosom of the earth. The constitutive blood relationships through which the family is structured are the relations between husband and wife, parents and children, and brother and sister. The brother thereby is a liminal figure because he is destined to transgress the order of the family and, as a male citizen, does not belong to the family, as Hegel says. As an adult, he passes from the divine law within whose realm he lived over to the human law. The sister, however, becomes, or the wife remains, director of the home and the preserver of divine law. In these sections, Hegel ignores the complex genealogical relations that is at stake in Antigone's burial of her brother, and he reduces kinship relations to marital, parental, and sibling relations. So he simply ignores the fact that the central conflict between Antigone and Creon is a conflict between an uncle and his niece, thus playing beyond the limits of the nuclear family. Hegel also neglects Antigone's relation to her sister Ismene and omits Antigone's troubled ancestry and the genealogical complexity of her relation to her various brothers. Indeed, Hegel is reluctant to address the problem of genealogy, or, as Tina Chanter has put it, the question of what separates one generation from another, although this question is central to Antigone's destiny, because it is precisely the one that Oedipus confounded when he fathered Antigone with his mother Jocasta. We see that Hegel just thus truncates the problematic as it is formulated in Sophocles' play and introduces an understanding of the family as a purely synchronic structure. A careful analysis of his text, however, reveals that he cannot fully avoid addressing questions of genealogy and diachronic kinship relations. So he briefly, for example, refers to the people, Volk, understood as a genealogical continuum that needs to be reproduced. The relation between husband and wife, Hegel claims, I quote, finds itself realized not in itself as such, but in the child and other in whose coming into being the relationship consists and with which it passes away. And this change from one generation onwards to another is permanent in and as the life of a people. The procreation of children thus must be seen as a broader reproductive process that transgresses the boundaries of the nuclear family. Hegel, however, does not further elaborate on the relation between the family and the people. And surprisingly, the whole issue of reproduction, which appears to be a theoretical hinge between the nation or the people and the family, is largely absent from his reflections on family and kinship. It only surfaces at the margins of his text, for example, when Hegel privileges the ethicality of the brother-sister relation. And he privileges it because this relation is, according to him, void of desire, and it does not include reproductive relations. Brother and sister, Hegel argues, are the same blood, which has, however, in them reached a state of rest and equilibrium. Therefore, they do not desire one another, nor have they given to or received from one another this independent being for self. On the contrary, they are free individualities in regard to each other. So reproduction is mentioned here, but only negatively as an impossibility of incest. With regard to the textual coherence, this omission of reproduction and omission of incest, however, is only possible because Hegel has omitted the problem of Antigone's descent. In the philosophy of right, Hegel articulates family and kinship relations in a different way. In the respective sections on family and kinship, these are no longer equated. In contrast, Hegel conceives of blood relationships as a specific form of collectivity, which is based on relations of descent. Blood relationships mean a form of relatedness that is distinct from the family, which, in Hegel's view, constitutes itself as an ethical unit through its distinction from the purely natural relation of consanguine kinship. I quote, "When marriage takes place," Hegel argues, "a new family is constituted, and this is self-sufficient for itself in relation to the kinship groups or houses from which it originated. Its links with the latter are based on the natural blood relationship, but the new family is based on ethical love." As in the Phenomenology, Hegel conceives of the family primarily as a synchronic unit and largely neglects the diachronic dimensions of kinship relations. These dimensions enter the picture only on a few occasions when Hegel touches somehow upon the issue of reproduction. This is, for example, the case when he mentions as a natural aspect of marriage, I quote, "the process which runs into the infinite progression of generations which produce and presuppose one another." However, Hegel explicitly discusses kinship relations that exceed the nuclear family in the philosophy of right with regard to property rights and with regard to poverty. In this view, his view, the nuclear family is constituted through marriage and sets itself apart from the broader economy of kinship. The property of an individual is, Hegel states, essentially connected with his marital relationship and only more distantly connected with his kinship group or house. Hegel obviously devalues property relations among extended kin groups in order to establish a certain understanding of the familial economy. The decline of kinship for Hegel appears to be a precondition for civil society or the system of all-around interdependence where individuals pursue their selfish ends. At the same time, Hegel also problematizes or at least notes the negative effects of the decline of the social significance of broader kinship relations beyond the nuclear family. In poverty, so when the system of needs cannot fulfill the needs of subsistence, the absence of kinship networks makes itself felt negatively as deficiency. In this case, Hegel argues individuals realize not only that, I quote, the natural means of acquisition have been destroyed, but that civil society also dissolves the bond of the family in its wider sense as a kinship group. Extended kinship relations here are again addressed from an economic point of view, but not with regard to the intergenerational transmission of property, but as a specific set of relations that guarantee the subsistence of its members. Insofar as subsistence economies have collapsed under the conditions of the capitalist economy and commodity exchange, the state acquires the task of providing an existential minimum. According to Hegel, the state takes over the role of the family and absorbs the patriarchal authority, which means the power of reprehension and education with respect to the poor's, what he calls the poor's laziness, viciousness, and other vices to which their predicament and sense of wrong give rise. However, of course, the state is unable to fully replace the economic function of broader kinship and subsistence networks because its institutions, were they to operate within the civil society or the family, would risk conforming to the particularism of these spheres. So to sum up this part, both in the phenomenology of spirit and in the philosophy of right, Hegel's theory of the family is based on a certain understanding of supra-generational kinship relations that are at the same time depoliticized and repoliticized with regard to political economy, the state, and the genealogical continuum of the people. In addition, the very distinction between family and kinship articulates a politicized hierarchy between modern and traditional European and non-European modes of living, insofar as Hegel constantly distinguishes the modern family he construes from earlier and geographically distant forms of kinship. As Tina Schenter has argued, Antigone is a racialized figure insofar as Hegel associates her in the lectures on aesthetics The chanter reads, insofar as Hegel associates her with the earlier Greek gods rather than the later, and aligns Antigone with the savagery of these gods of Eastern heritage, those misshapen, formless gods of another race. So although Hegel does not refer explicitly to geopolitics or race, these issues indirectly impact on his articulations of the family and kinship relations. And in the next part, I will turn to Hegel's section on anthropology in the philosophy of spirit, in which he develops his understanding of racial diversity. There, Hegel does not address the family or kinship relations, but his critique of the genealogical concept of race, I think, corresponds with his negative treatment of genealogy in the discussion of these issues, as I have just presented. When in the late 18th century, monogenists and polygenicists struggled over the question whether humankind could be traced back to one origin or whether humankind or manifold humankinds originated at different places of the earth. They all clearly assumed that political and moral consequences would follow from their genealogical accounts. Hegel, however, challenges this assumption and rejects any genealogical argument with regard to racial hierarchies. This critique of genealogical thinking indeed correlates with its neglect and devaluation of diachronic kinship relations, both in the Phenomenology and the philosophy of right. And I think it also echoes his overall critique of political privilege based on descent. Hegel, however, presents his own take on the issue of what he calls race diversities, Rassenverschiedenheit in German, based on a specific understanding of descent that does not refer to reproductive processes, but to the generative process of the earth itself. This account of racial diversity is condensed in a short, relatively good known paragraph and an addition in the section of anthropology in the third part of the encyclopedia, but it impacts hugely on his understanding of world history and the development of spirit. In paragraph 393, Hegel contends, I quote, that the general planetary life of the nature-governed spirit specializes itself into the concrete differences of the earth and breaks up into the several nature-governed spirits, which, on the whole, give expression to the nature of the geographical continents and the diversities of race. Hegel here refers to the race discourse that had developed since the mid-18th century and indeed played a role in the emergence of anthropology as a distinct field of knowledge. Hegel does not question the political epistemic project of distinguishing and classifying races or human populations. He just questions a genealogical definition of the concept of race, as it was formulated by Kant, according to which the concept of race refers to hereditary differences which are transmitted through reproduction. In the addition to paragraph 393, we read, I quote, that descent affords no ground for granting or denying freedom and dominion to human beings. Man, we also read, is implicitly rational. Herein lies the possibility of equal justice for all men and the futility of a rigid distinction between species of humans that have rights and those that have none. Instead, Hegel claims that diversities of race are connected with the geographical differences of the soil, where human beings are gathered together in masses. On the basis of the distinction between the old and the new world, Hegel gives a brief sketch of the continents and of the landscapes of Africa, Asia, and Europe, which in a nutshell somehow entails this argument about the correspondence between physical and mental differences among the races and the geographical circumstances that constitute these differences. Africa, in Hegel's account, I quote, appears as a landmass belonging to a compact unity, as a lofty mountain range shutting off the coast. Asia is characterized by, I quote, the antithesis of highlands and great valleys irrigated by broad rivers, while the third, Europe, reveals the unity of the undifferentiated unity of Africa and the unmediated antithesis of Asia. So against the backdrop of the underlying conceptual pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, it comes as no surprise that for Hegel, it is only in the Europeans, what he calls the Caucasian race, that spirit first attains to absolute unity with itself and enters into complete opposition to the life of nature. In Africa, spirit is, according to Hegel, in contrast, I quote, quite dormant, remaining sunk within itself and making no progress, and thus corresponding to the compact, differenceless mass of the African continent. What is most noteworthy here is that in contrast to Kant's proto-biological concept of race that relied on Buffon's notion of the species as a reproductive continuum, Hegel does not refer to the emerging, around 1800, emerging life sciences, but to the sciences of geology and geography. This, however, does not mean that he rejects any genealogical considerations. On the contrary, his spatial account of racial diversity includes a temporal and genealogical dimension as well, so that as a result, geographical space and the potential for historical development coincide. Indeed, geological time, as conceived of in the contemporary debates on the historicity of the Earth, plays a central role in Hegel's argument. Since the late 17th century, research on fossils and the reconstruction of volcanic activities of the Earth on the basis of geological stratification and mountains had led to scrutiny of biblical notions of time, such as a contention, for example, that creation took 7 days. As a consequence, the temporal horizons of the histories of the Earth and of humanity were considerably broadened, and the understanding of the Earth itself was temporalized. With reference to this intellectual development, and much in line with his contemporaries, Henrik Steffens and Karl Ritter, Hegel conceived of the Earth as an organism that has produced a spatial differentiation, or, as he puts it, an external system of different members. Hegel's Eurocentrism is thus based on a temporalization of space or a territorialization of temporality. With regard to genealogy, it follows that his account of racial diversity, I think, operates on two levels. On the one hand, Hegel explicitly rejects a proto-biological genealogical understanding of race as based on reproduction and heredity. On the other hand, he introduced an understanding of genealogy and belonging, according to which races have been generated through the earth itself. So while Hegel is critical about the social and political meaning of supragenerational reproductive relations, as in his discussions of kinship and the family, he rearticulates genealogy and belonging in a different way. As I have shown in the previous parts, Hegel is reluctant to refer to relations of reproduction, both in his account of racial diversity and in his theory of the family and kinship. In the philosophy of nature, however, he develops a theory of sexual reproduction that clearly underlies his accounts of kinship and the family. Basically, Hegel assumes that spirit divests itself into nature and proceeds into various stages in order to return from nature into itself. And sexual reproduction, in Hegel's view, emerges only at a certain stage of this process, which covers mechanics, physics, and organic physics. With regard to the organic world or organic physics, Hegel distinguishes between geological nature, vegetal nature, and the animal organism. In his account, only at the stage of the animal, reproduction emerges as a central feature. The plant, according to Hegel, lacks sex and thus the ability to reproduce. He considers the plant as being only, I quote, a multiplication of itself. This is the case because sexual reproduction, in Hegel's view, requires two sexually different individuals, not just sexually different organs that belong to a single organism. I quote, "The sexual relationship proper must have for its opposed moments entire individuals whose determinatedness, completely reflected into itself, spreads through the whole individual. The entire habitus of the individual must be bound up with its sex." Insofar as sexual reproduction in the full sense for Hegel emerges only in animal nature, it is always mediated by forms of consciousness. In particular, it functions through the experience of need and want, which draws the two different but complementary individuals to each other. It is a relation to the other who at the same time belongs to the same genus and in whom the individual achieves self-feeling in the act of feeling itself in the other. As this sentence and the following make perfectly clear, the sexual encounter And the reproductive unification of the two sexes is a first form of intersubjectivity that Hegel conceives of. It is a relation to an other who is understood simultaneously as equal and different, and through whom the individual develops a perception of itself. Hegel is obviously not referring to animals alone, but primarily to human interaction. Through the male and the female, there emerges a determination of the entire structure, a different habitus, which in humans also extends to the spiritual sphere and becomes a distinct natural feature, Hegel says. As in Hegel's reflections on love and marriage in the philosophy of right, the dualism of the sexes in the philosophy of nature is geared towards unification. The union of the sexes, Hegel claims, is a disappearance of the sexes into which the simple genus has developed. This is based on the fact that for Hegel, the sexes share an original identity, which, however, expresses itself differently. While for the woman, indifference is essential, for the man, it is a moment of duality, the opposition. This distinction for Hegel translates into the difference between activity or activity and receptivity, which is the main difference that structures his ideas about femininity and masculinity in the phenomenology and the philosophy of right, where the male is conceived of as being, I quote, in its eternal relation, powerful and active, the female or the woman as being passive and subjective. Sexual reproduction, one can conclude, thus lies at the heart of Hegel's construction of hierarchical gender relation. Also for Hegel, sex difference, as required by and constituted through reproduction, is primarily a natural form of difference. The sexual relation acquires in the family its spiritual and ethical meaning and determination. That's still in the philosophy of nature. But this is also clearly, or he's clearly speaking here about this historically specific form of alliance and descent that he construes in the phenomenology and the philosophy of right. And from the perspective of the philosophy of nature, the family thus appears to be primarily a reproductive unit. I will now briefly conclude, and then we can have a discussion. By tracing the elements of genealogical thinking in Hegel's texts, I have explored the semantic, or tried to explore the semantic interrelations between Hegel's discussions of kinship, race, and reproduction. So my intention in doing so was not to claim that Hegel has developed a coherent theoretical approach or that he gave a historical sound representation of social and cultural transformations of kinship relations. In contrast, my aim was to reveal semantic interrelations that are widely unacknowledged between these issues. And as I said in the beginning, I think that this is not only relevant for critical Hegel scholarship today, but more generally for developing a critical theory of gender relations as intertwined with relations of racialization, colonialism, class, property, the state, and the nation. I think that a critical exploration of Hegel's texts And in particular, his accounts of kinship, family, race, and reproduction can help us to develop a critical social theory that scrutinizes structural correlations between multiple modes of power and domination, and that goes beyond a quite narrow understanding of intersectionality that focuses on the intersection of different forms of discriminations, but does not account for the social structures, social, economic, and political structures that make these intersections possible. Above that, I think that reading Hegel from a critical perspective, in particular his accounts of kinship, race, and reproduction, also raises our awareness of the complexity of crises of kinship and the family that shape our present, even though these crises are obviously different from those Hegel dealt with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll take a 5-minute break now, just to let people stretch their legs or whatever, and then we'll start again and take questions, obviously. So it's now, well, almost 20 past, so be back at 25 past. Is that okay? And we'll take the questions then. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful paper, Susanne. You mentioned with regard to Rassenverschiedenheit that Hegel opposed his geographical theory to Kant's genealogical theory. And I'm wondering where Hegel derived that. Did he think it up on his own, or did he get it from Johann Friedrich Blumenbach or Petrus Kamper or one of those early anthropologists?
Thanks for the question. Well, I say, Kant is, formulated this concept of race with reference to Blumenbach and Buffon, and that was widely read and discussed in that time. And parallel, or a bit later, these geographical accounts of race started to be discussed as well. So I think Hegel relies on authors or such as Karl Ritter, who is one of the founding authors of geography or Erdkunde, the earth sciences, in the early 19th century. Steffens might be a bit later. He's a Schelling, friend of Schelling, but also has expresses quite similar views on the earth as an organism that has different members, and these different members, or different parts and members, correlate with the races, and it's a whole, but it's also a hierarchically structured whole. I think a very important author in that conversation on landscapes, geography, and the physical and mental characters of human populations is also Alexander von Humboldt, who does not engage in an overtly Eurocentric account of race diversity as Hegel does and as Kant does, but who's also obviously widely read and introduces a new idea of how to conceptualize landscapes and the relation of humans to these landscapes. So, I mean, what we now call human geography is something that is new there, and so it's not something that Hegel invents out of the blue, that argument, but it refers to contemporary scientific and political ethical discourses, I think.
Thank you.
Good, great. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Susanne. I really enjoyed that. Sorry, just one response to the question that was raised before. I suppose Winkelmann is also important for this, in that the close connection he sees between Greek thinking and the sky under which they work. But so I would want to add him into the mix too. I wanted to ask you though about the relationship between what you call the neglect of the diachronic in Hegel and Hegel's method, both in the phenomenology and in the philosophy of right. And I want to suggest that it's not just a neglect, it's more principled than that. And some things you say suggest to me that you might agree with this, but I'm not sure. So let me explain what I mean. So if we take the philosophy of right, I take the view, and I know this is not everyone accepts this, that the philosophy of right is largely normative. That what it's doing is setting out what it is and must be to be free. It's not giving a description of the modern state. It's setting out the forms of freedom. And Hegel thinks that those forms of freedom are justified, not historically, but logically. And I think this finds expression in that passage you read out from the Anthropology, where he says that Abstammung does not provide a justification. So all that can provide a justification would be the very logic of freedom. Now, it's not just that history doesn't provide the justification, whereas the logic of freedom does, but in certain forms of freedom, the freedom itself requires breaking with some of the historical and genealogical connections that one has. And the family is a very good example of that. So Hegel's very interested in the way that one severs a connection with a previous family and forms a new one out of freedom. And in fact, even, I'm looking at paragraph 162, even when a marriage has been arranged by the parents, it's still got to be die freie Einwilligung der Person. So that seems to me quite principled and deliberate and conscious. And so I wanted you to sort of say something about that, if you wouldn't mind. And then on the phenomenology, again, I think there are structural and methodological reasons, perhaps, why Hegel is not so interested in the diachronic aspect, as you say. And that's got to do with the form of life or Gestalt of consciousness that he's talking about under immediate ethical life, which after all, that's not an account of Sophocles' play. It's not an account of the family. It's an account of a particular form of ethical life in which the substantial universal is immediately one with the individual. And the paradox of all of this is that the individual only comes to be properly universal when he's dead. I mean, that's the thing that's really, it seems to be striking about that whole analysis, is that if you think that there's got to be an immediate connection between individual and substantial, then there's only one conclusion. You've got to be dead to be properly universal. And of course, we get that echoed then later in the French Revolution, where again, freedom amounts to a certain death. So again, it seems to me there are particular reasons why Hegel focuses on, or as you say, neglects the diachronic in favor of the synchronic. And that's got to do perhaps with method rather than any kind of neglect. So anyway, sorry, there's a lot there. I just wondered if you could respond perhaps to that and see whether you agree or disagree.
Yes, thank you. I think I absolutely agree with you that there are reasons why he neglects, and maybe neglection is not the best way to frame this kind of omission or not thematizing diachronic relationships on a certain level. Because indeed, as you said, the thing is, it is a complex question. I think indeed there are political, ethical reasons for him that have to do with his positive relation to the French Revolution and to modernity, and the critique of the Ancien Régime. So the transmission of wealth and privilege and power through genealogical belonging and kinship relations. So that is clear, and that is, I think, as far as I see, a very, very coherent stance he takes throughout his writings, and in all the different aspects or facets where I have traced these genealogical elements. So I think also his critique of Kant's genealogical concept of race fits very well with this political argument that you have sketched out with regards to the philosophy of right. So I absolutely agree with that. As to the methodological question, my feeling is that, I mean, Hegel's method is so diachronically oriented. I mean, the notion of development, the movement, the dialectics, that is, there is on a very basic level, an understanding of succession, that one form succeeds the other. And as far as I see this, on this level, there is absolutely no neglect, but a positive adaptation of temporal thought. And this is at least partly also related to his positive reception of discussions that evolve in that period around the life sciences. So in the philosophy of nature, he starts with a reference to Goethe's notion of metamorphosis, and which is related to plant development in Goethe. So this is clearly a contribution from Goethe's side to the debate on how organisms develop and unfold. So, and Hegel refers to it and takes it up and makes his own argument about it on the metamorphosis of the concept and the development of the concept. So I think you're also right that on that methodological level, one cannot say that there is a neglect of diachronic consciousness that is foundational. And what I try to argue with respect to these other parts is that although he is so reluctant to address or to speak about diachronic relationships among humans or society, he cannot avoid. There are always these small passages on the people or on reproduction that somehow pop up. So
yes, I mean, I just want to comment on the method. I mean, yes, in one sense you're right, that's diachronic, but at least my reading of it, it's logical. Even, I mean, certainly in the phenomenology, again, this is a matter of debate, I suppose, but my reading would be that the connection between the different shapes in the phenomenology is a logical one. And indeed, actually, although not everybody accepts this, in the philosophy of history too. I mean, there is no historical connection between Persia and India in the way that Hegel's bending, but there's a logical connection between them. So again, but that's not, it seems to me, the diachrony that you're kind of wanting Hegel to say more about. So there is that sense of logical development, yes, but again, that seems to me not so much a neglect of diachrony, but a kind of refusal to allow merely historical Abstammung to determine what counts as logically necessary. I guess that's what I had in mind. But anyway, I thank you for the paper very much, and I'll let you respond perhaps, and then other people obviously want to have a go.
Did you want to respond again, or should we move on?
I don't
Just
know.
for the point about method, the method is development successive, but logically developmental, rather than, if you like, genealogically developmental. That's kind of what I had in mind.
Yes, maybe we're not so far away from each other, because with genealogically or genealogical development or diachronic development, I do not mean that there should be, or that I assume there is or there should be, a kind of historical account. I mean, okay. Hegel is far away from being a historian in our sense of a real scholar of history. So that
but he's also not Foucault.
I mean, that is highly construed. I mean, also all of these figurations of the family or kinship, I mean, there's no there is a relation to, I would argue that there is a relation to the social and historical processes in which Hegel is situated, and that he, I mean, when the historians say he's a witness of this political and social transformation, this kind of naive language, I would say. He's not witnessing, he's doing much more. But that is not to say, so, but there is a relation to what is going on in his time. But this is not a, far from being a description, it's highly construed, and it is construed within this narrative, I would say, that takes this form of logics. Yeah, so whether this is logics or not might be another point of discussion. But so I think I fully agree with you with regard to the understanding of his historical account. It's not an historical account in any contemporary present sense of the word.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Good. Viren is next.
Yes, thank you very much for this very, very informative and well-articulated presentation. I wanted to just make two comments and sort of their sort of clarifications. So the first one is that I felt, I mean, you're dealing with an enormous amount of material, and I was trying to follow the ways in which they came together, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I felt that on the one hand you had a kind of a discussion of the family, right, and you know, a discussion of gender relations, and then that then moved on to a kind of critique of race and almost geography or almost geographical categories and so on, and the earth and so on. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about how these two come together, and how they're related. And this, you know, might touch on some of the questions you were just addressing about, you know, say logic and history and so on, because, you know, I was thinking about when you were talking about, I think you mentioned paragraph 393 of the philosophy of spirit, and that brought in the way in which you have, say, the way Hegel discusses the differences between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And it seems there that he says that Europe is a kind of a unity of undifferentiated, unity of undifferentiated unity of Africa and the unmediated opposition of Asia, right? And what I thought here immediately was, I thought of the philosophy of history or the lectures on world history, where there's another element, which is the sea. And that doesn't seem to, where the sea represents the infinite. And I was wondering that isn't there. And I was just wondering how these things come together, and whether, when you think of that, then you think about the gender relation. Are you making are you saying that Hegel is making an analogy there? I mean, because clearly spirit is an important part here, and then how spirit relates to gender and so on could be one of these issues. And I think then relates to what you were saying at the very end. Because what you're saying, because that got to the whole point of what are the stakes in all of this? Why are we, and that gets to, well, where are we going with all of this? And I thought that became clear at the end when you said that what you want to do, and the point of doing this whole exercise is not just, to say something about Hegel, which of course is important, but it's to go beyond what you call the intersectionality of different forms of oppression. Right. So that's why the link between all of these is crucial to the enterprise, because it's when you make that link that you can say, hey, we can go beyond the intersectionality of different forms of oppression and get to a more holistic account. And I was wondering if you could say more about what that account would be. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much for this question. Well, indeed, I start with your first comment, and then move to the intersectionality, because indeed they are related. I have tried to trace what I've called elements of genealogical thinking, or elements in Hegel's texts where he deals with problems of genealogy, or genealogy and reproduction. And through this lens, I'm trying to make the argument that we can see connections between these parts of his philosophy that are otherwise without any connection. I mean, the section on the races in the philosophy of spirit, and the sections on the family and Antigone, they're not, there's no argument on narrative around this that really brings them together. No coherent argument about. So it is only through that lens, on focusing on how he deals with issues of genealogy, descent, and reproduction, that I think one can see that there is an implicit connection. There is a kind of coherence in the sense of what Stephen said, and that there is a kind of political reluctance or criticism of Hegel against these older forms of transmitting privilege. So these are not, it's not incoherent to bring these paragraphs together, but that is my specific intervention, the reading of Hegel to bring them together. I do not claim that he made any of these arguments explicitly. On the one hand, I think that through that lens on genealogy and descent, one can trace semantic connections between some of the themes that Hegel deals with, in particular with regard to race and gender. But we can also, class or property, so the economy of modern society, commodity production, capitalism. So there is an interrelation, but on the other hand, we also see by tracing these elements that these issues and the problems that are connected are not on the same level. So what is required, and that would be a next step, would be to, beyond Hegel, of course, to take serious these epistemic and structural differences of these problems that are connected, but not homologues. And this is where I somehow depart from, not from intersectionality as a general approach, but from the term and from some accounts who, in my view, have a kind of flat ontology and take all these identities or categories, gender, race, class, and so on, to be on the same level. And I think that by reading Hegel and tracing these elements, we see that there are connections, but it is also important to stress the different historical and political structures to which these elements refer. And I think in particular with regard to the philosophy of Freie, to the distinction between the family, civil society, and the state, this is a kind of attempt to account for a social structure. I mean, even though it's not perfect, and from sort of critical perspectives in terms of post and decolonialism, gender and queer studies, of course, many scholars have gone beyond this, but in contrast to that flat ontology of intersectionality discourse, I think what is valuable there is this attempt to figure out social structures. I'm not sure if I really answered it.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you. That's helpful, but I don't want to. I think there are a number of other people waiting.
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind, we perhaps should move on. So we've got two questions, and I'll maybe ask one if there's time, but we've got about 10 minutes. So is that all right, Vern? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I might. We can always, if there's time, we can come back.
Come back to it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tiana is next.
Just a second. Okay, thank you very much for a really interesting lecture. I guess my question possibly goes in the direction of what Professor Holgate was saying, that is the diachronic versus the synchronic, and in particular to the view of the family, for example, in the Phenomenology and in philosophy of right. So if we take the Phenomenology to represent that there is the internal logic of movement, as it were, which is not diachronic logic, let's say, of movement, and synchronic logic of each historical world, which is examined within the spirit's each successive step and coming to consciousness. And so Antigone would be just one part of this, and the family that he talks about, or the way that he conceives family in Phenomenology of Spirit, is quite different to that of philosophy of right, obviously, where the love for the sibling doesn't even, or if it appears only marginally, perhaps commented once. So the world of Antigone is the world which, from the perspective of the philosophy of right, belongs to the past, as it were. It is circumscribed to a particular era, to particular epoch, and it is no longer in this coming to itself of the spirit. It is no longer the one that is operative in the philosophy of right. So how do you see this then, that there is in effect the internal relationship between the diachronic and the synchronic, and that the relationship between the husband and wife is put somehow in the second place in the Phenomenology, whereas in the philosophy of right it becomes the central one, and that's the focus of Hegel's analysis. So the family is also different, and somehow seems to me that the crucial element would be, which is possibly why Hegel in Phenomenology couldn't have analyzed it in the same way is because already from, you know, the Hegel Francofortese, as the Italians would say, he introduces the concept of love, and love is peculiarly related to modernity for Hegel. So in the Phenomenology, there is no this kind of love that we find in the philosophy of right. And then I was just, you know, reading these days the Allegra De Laurentiis and her book on Hegel's anthropology, and she actually has this part dedicated to the relationship between the sexes, and she makes this quite sort of peculiar point that somehow in the philosophy of right that we find in a way a homology between the spirit and the nature, and that the relationship between the sexes from the point of view of teleology of the nature and from the point of view of teleology of the spirit is the same, which is precisely what in a way you were saying when you were talking about the reproduction element. So given that Hegel puts or frames the reproduction and the relationship of marriage in a very peculiar historical epoch, which is also part of the spirit coming to itself, as it were, and that he analyzes the relationship between the sexes. De Laurentiis makes a point that this homology between the nature,
sorry,
I'm coming to an end.
Okay.
The homology between the nature and the spirit is actually important because she says these two opposite poles can only come together precisely because they have nothing in common. One pursues particularity, the other pursues the universality in a way, and that's in a way her point. So I'm interested to see how you would situate the reproduction in this particular question between the phenomenology and the philosophy of right and love and brother, sister, and husband, wife.
Well, thank you. That was also a comment, and I'm not sure if I can answer it all. So I try with some elements, and others I think I have to think about it. Well, with regard to nature and spirit, I think what is important, and probably there's no disagreement, is there is not a there's no dualism in Hegel, but that, I mean, the spirit that invests itself into reality and then tries to come back. So nature is always already somehow spiritualized to different degrees. So there's no, as some readings would have it, but I think that is probably not the case here. There's absolutely no naturalization in the strong sense of reproduction or family relations or gender relations here. Although, I mean, that is complicated. Hegel also talks about or makes a distinction between the natural ethical community and the ethical community of the family. But well, in the one quote that was from the philosophy of spirit, no, from the philosophy of nature on reproduction at the very end, was quite explicit, where Hegel says that reproduction, as he has explained it within the philosophy of nature, is ethicalized or gets its ethical form in the family. So there is a clear reference to his other writings on the family, and the turn to or the acknowledgement that reproduction is different in, or he conceives it as being different in animals and in humans. And in particular, in this arrangement that is constituted through love and constitutes itself as an ethical unit, in contrast to kinship. So there are different layers on the natural and non-natural or thing there. As to the relation between phenomenology and philosophy of right, you're absolutely right. They are not identical, and there are many differences that need to be taken into account if one goes into much more detail on these paragraphs on family and kinship. However, there's also a relation, because in the philosophy of right, Hegel explicitly refers to Antigone again. So there is a connection that he himself makes. And as you probably know, there are, of course, myriad of readings, of feminist readings of the figure of Antigone in the Phenomenology. And there are some who, well, take Hegel for presenting trans-historical truths about, I don't know, care ethics and femininity or masculinity, and some who try to completely historicize this and take it as an account of historically correct or not, but read it as an historical account of the family or kinship relations in Greek antiquity. I don't think that, I think that neither the historicalization of that and ascribing or taking it as an account of the Greek family, nor just to focus only, which is of course true, that the phenomenology does not end with a chapter of Antigone, but taking it for itself and taking a look at what he introduces there at family relations. This seems to me to be a quite modern idea and highly specific idea of the relations that count as family. So this is brother, sister, husband, wife, and parents, children. So, and it has indeed nothing to do is too strong, but I mean, taken the, if you take it serious, the fact that Antigone's Sophocles play is what he introduced here. He is very selective in what kind of, which relations he takes out and implements into his narrative of the phenomenology. So I would not subscribe to the interpretation that it is a formation that belongs completely to the past. Although I know that there are different readings and that it is a constant discussion.
No, just a second. I didn't mean that he completely, obviously for Hegel, nothing is ever completely in the past. So I did not mean that there is a radical caesura. It's just that there are two conceptions of the family, and that husband-wife relationship in the phenomenology is on the second place, whereas in the philosophy of right, it's the first. And he, in phenomenology, is more focused on the Antigone as this female figure, as it were, whereas in the philosophy of right, this figure of feminine and femininity and woman and the role that woman is ascribed changes precisely because from the kinship relation of siblings, we come to that of conjugal relationship between a husband and wife in a way.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely agree.
Okay, good. We better move on. One last question, I think, from Christoph. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that presentation of that very interesting paper. So I'm very much with you on the idea that, you know, a fully developed intersectionality or an intersectionality worthy of its name must be rooted in economic and political analysis and so on. So I was very taken by this idea. And I just wanted to raise a question about the second section on race. So it struck me that one way that you might think about the move to geography, this is actually kind of a regressive move, and that what you get in Hegel is a return to something that's very common in the 18th century among the French philosophes, which is to root racial difference in geographical difference. And I just wondered how you would respond to this as a challenge, or what you would kind of say on Hegel's behalf, if anything. If the challenge is something like, it looks like his theory of race is, I mean, it looks worse than Kant's sort of theory rooted in Blumenbach and these people, right? Because he's just going back to what's a matter of geographical difference, and that's the kind of baseline. And I mean, the things that he says about Africa, which you quoted, are just, you know, absolutely horrendous. If if the idea is something like, well, you know, in Africa, you know, the reason's sort of somewhere there, but it must remain dormant in this way because of something to do with the geography. And I'm sure that you would. Well, I'm just very interested to see what would be wrong with that reading, or what you would say in response. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, actually, I'm not sure if it's worse than Kant, because I mean, if you read Kant's essays on race, it's also very explicit and very stigmatizing. But they are different, and I think he's not just going taking up these earlier accounts from the 17th and 18th century. Indeed, the territory has always played a role in distinguishing human populations, and the climate theory has been very influential. That's probably what you referred to, that according to the climate, bodies, but also mental faculties take different shapes. But so this is, of course, there's never really sharp break in intellectual history. So this also plays a role, but I think he's quite modern and up to his time in these discussions too, because geography and geology too were in the early 19th century sciences that underwent kind of conceptual change. So I mentioned Alexander von Humboldt, who well, introduced, of course, measurements, so but also a new idea of what he called physiognomics of plants and of landscapes. So to a kind of integral view on humans and the regions of the earth which they inhabit. And so I think Hegel indeed refers to these contemporary debates, like his contemporaries Steffens or Ritter and other authors too. And yes, well, I mean, this paragraph has been widely debated in Hegel scholarship that deals with the question of race and Eurocentrism, because it is the section where he explicitly deals with the issue. I think, but this is open to discussion, and then probably there are others who are much more into these post and decolonial readings of Hegel who can answer this better. As far as I see, this section is a small one, but of course it is a very basic one, because it is in the part of anthropology, and then of course the story goes on. Hegel does not stop there, but he does not distance himself from it. So it's a small section, and I think it is important to take it serious because it underlies the rest of the narration. And indeed, he has this references to world spirit that only unfolds in Europe in an adequate way. So there are these connections to all the other parts of his philosophy, but that, of course, would be another talk, and maybe by somebody else who can read all these texts and chapters.
Good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Is that okay, Christoph? Good. Great. Well, we're slightly over time, but I think it was worth continuing to get those questions through. Thank you then very much for a great talk and a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. And just to briefly mention that our last talk in this series is in fact next week on Tuesday, not Monday, same time, 5:30 to 7 by Frank Ruder at Dundee, and the title is Release and then /Entlassen. So I hope to see you for the last talk, but thank you very much, Professor Lettow. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion and thanks for having me.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Susanna. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.